Dr. Foluke Ifejola Adebisi is a professor at the Law School, University of Bristol. Her scholarship focuses mainly on the relationship between theories of decolonization and how they do and can interact with legal knowledge. Thus, her scholarly work is concerned with what happens at the intersection of legal education, law, society, and a history of changing ideas of what it means to be human. She has written widely in this area. She also edited a special issue for the Law Teacher Journal on decolonization in 2019. She found and runs Forever Africa Conference Conference. She blogs about her scholarship and pedagogy on her website, Foluke's African Skies. Her monograph, Decolonization and Legal Knowledge, Reflections on Power and Possibility, was published by Bristol University Press in March 2023. Dr. Adebisi, the floor is yours.
Let me put
You're muted.
Yeah. I always forget to do that. So good, I think everyone, it's 9 a.m. for most people here. Good morning, everyone. It's afternoon sort of here, although it looks like, well, the sun is not coming out till March in the UK. So good afternoon from the UK. Let me say the magic words and share my slides, and then I'll go for it. I keep forgetting where because the button's in different places and different platforms. Can we see that? Okay, fabulous. So thank you, Phoebe, for that introduction. I also want to thank Scott for inviting me and to Chanel for getting me straight on the time zones, which absolutely not my strong point. I was still half afraid that I had gotten it wrong and I was either 1 hour late or 1 hour early. And special thank you to the African Studies at Penn State for this opportunity. And thank you to everyone who's turned up. I don't sort of minimize the time and effort it takes to listen to people talking heads on Zoom. So I really appreciate you all turning up to listen to me speak. So I've been given 40 to 45, I guess, minutes to talk on this topic, on making the wretched of the earth. Can we aim towards testamentary life within legal knowledge? And essentially what I would like to do in this talk is to try and respond to that question, not really answer the question. I'm a lawyer, so I tend to not want to actually answer any question lest I be held liable for something. So I'm going to try and respond to the question by sharing with you my own reflections. And I think it would be interesting to see what questions and conversations that we can generate towards the end, especially in a cross transdisciplinary way on that question. What does it mean to be human? Which is something that has animated my own work since I began. I started in legal practice before I went into academia, and so this is a question I have been trying to answer from within the law. And spoiler alert, one of the things that I will be saying is I'm not entirely sure the law on its own can answer that question. So the sort of structure of the talk I want to go through today is I'll start by contextualizing the argument within my own work. So the argument I'm making about what it means to be human, where is it situated within my own recent work? And then I'll try and answer the question, who is law's human? How does law conceive of what is or who can be considered to be human? Why? What are the hierarchies that the law produces within that question? And how has the law's human been constructed over time? What are the reproductions and sort of points of departure of who we consider to be law's human? How are they produced through certain histories, certain social, political, social, legal, socioeconomic sort of processes and structures? And then I'd like to consider, what is the impact of this particular production? What impact does it have on modalities of life, but also on the law? So what is the effect of laws human on the ontology of law if the law does have an ontology? And what does it really mean because of this impact? What does it mean to be human? How do we experience being human in a world that is completely governed by law and the social structures that law produces? And therefore, how does the law shape our realities? What we consider to be reality, how does the law shape it? And if the law is shaping those realities, are there any ways we can either interrupt that from within the law or from outside the law? How can we change the world, essentially, is my really tiny question. And because of that question, it's one of the reasons I'm saying it's a reflection rather than an answer. How can we change the world is a question that I think we have grappled with for many, many years. Inside and outside of academia, and I think we're still grappling with it. So I want to situate that particular question within, so Phoebe in her introduction talked about my recent monograph. There's some other work which is adjacent to this that I don't want to sort of sit here and talk about everything I've written, that will take a while, not be very interesting either. But I want to talk about where this sits within this monograph that I wrote, because it's just so you sort of see what led to this question, or how that question was arrived at, and some of the points of departure, or some of the reasons why this question was asked in the way in which it was asked. So in this particular book, so it's I think important to explain how I came to write the book, especially in the context of UK higher education, where quite a lot of people were talking about decolonization, and people were saying that they had decolonized their teaching, which is a phrase that I struggle and really disagree with. I don't know what that means. And so because I write a lot about decolonization, I felt like I was trying to answer the question of what does it mean to to decolonize the law curriculum. And I kept on saying, well, it's impossible, but how do you explain that? So I wrote a book to answer the question, as all academics tend to do. So I start out in the book by trying to explain why decolonization as a massive political structure or political process is relevant to the law school today, and also try and define decolonization. I will not bore you with my sort of hair-pulling moments at trying to define decolonization, which I think at the end of the chapter, I say, well, there's not one definition for it. But I think more important to the question of what it means to be human is trying to think about the ontology of the law and how the law has been complicit in producing a colonial world. And in this particular chapter, I'm looking at how the law has been complicit in processes such as racialized enslavement and dispossessive or extractive colonization, how the law has been complicit in underpinning those particular systems. And part of that, the law's complicity, has to do with defining what it means to be human in the world. And I've underlined that because that's really what I'm going to talk about today. So what does it mean to be human in the world is produced by law's interaction with these processes. And it's always important to note that both racialized enslavement and dispossessive colonization had particular purposes. So their main sort of driving force was the accumulation of capital. And the accumulation of capital required particular conceptualizations of human space and time. And so in the middle of the book, I try and unpack those conceptualizations, also noting that there's an overlap. So the fact that particular spaces can be colonized or are colonizable is related to the fact that particular bodies are enslavable. But the fact that particular bodies are enslavable also is related or determined by where they exist, and how all of those are then sort of packed into concepts of modernity or Afrofuturism, which is a device or African futurism, because I use both of them, which are devices I use to unpack or to try and unsettle the processes of these. And then I consider how we should respond from within the law school. And, as a template, I would say, for other disciplines to think about. So the key question I always, I've been, like I said, I have been concerned with, or my scholarship has been driven by, is what does it mean to be human, especially as someone who started out in practice and thinking about how the law itself orders different understandings of what it means to be human, especially in the way the law protects or doesn't protect different sort of hierarchies, or these hierarchies, these artificial manufactured hierarchies. I find Anna Greer's writing on this really interesting. So she writes across sort of like company law, but also environmental law and human rights law, and it's an interesting conjunction. And she suggests that within the foundations of law, there's a particular universal vision of a human being for whom the law is made, so around whom the law revolves, and that's the rational man. And in the law of tort, so in negligence, we say that the standard of care is the standard of care of the reasonable. So we say reasonable person, but we used to use the phrase reasonable man up until the 80s. And then people said, well, does it only cater for men? So we changed it to person, but we didn't change the concept itself. And this rational man doesn't actually fit anybody. But according to Crenshaw, Dusinas, and Greer, and all people who are within law who are really concerned with this question, what's the universal vision of the human being? The actual human being that exists, that this concept of rationality, this reasonable person, the person for whom the law is made, the vision of that person is, or the closest vision, is the property owning heteronormative European man. But that's the closest actually existing human being for which the law is made. But Anna Greer suggests that the vision of this rational man perfectly matches the corporate form, which is interesting because the corporate form doesn't have a body. So to be human in this world, to be properly human in the eyes of the law, means to be not human. And the more human you are, the more we are defined by our bodies, racialized, gendered, sexuality, ability, class, etc. The more we are defined by our body, the further we move away from this law's perfect human. And this has historically and currently confusing outcome. Like I said, the corporate form doesn't have a body. So the law really is about legal personality. Who has personality? Who is a person, which is slightly different from who is human. But I'm concerned with who is human because that's where questions of protection and living and sort of modalities of life are more interesting. But the law actually is more interested in the concept of legal persons. So you've got one example of a confusing outcome is that under or during racialized enslavement, legal personality or recognition as a person or as law's human in the eyes of the law was afforded slave trading corporations, but not racialized human beings who were being enslaved. So corporations are more, in that sense, protected. And an example of that is the Gregson and Gilbert case, or also known as the Zong case, which I will summarize very, very briefly. So this case was decided in 1783, but the facts of the case happened in 1781. About 130 enslaved, or more technically accurate, kidnapped Africans were thrown overboard this slave ship called Zong. The reasons for that were that the ship had gone astray and the food and water supplies were running low. And so the captain, in his wisdom, felt that, well, this cargo has been insured. If these people die, they will not be able to collect on the insurance. However, if they throw them overboard and claim that they had to do that, there was a necessity in legal terms, then they would be able to collect on the insurance. So they did that, 130 people thrown overboard, and then go to court and claim for the insurance. So a case of, you would say, self-confessed murder. And the court says, well, yes, at the first court of first instance, so the court where they bring their case for the first time, the court says, yes, you can claim for insurance, and they granted them £30 per head. You think about what £30 was, the value of £30 in 1783 when the case was decided. On appeal, because the insurance company did not want to pay out. On appeal, they said they couldn't claim on the insurance because they hadn't proven that there was actually a necessity to do this, which suggests that if there was a necessity, they could have thrown them overboard. And then to go back to the question, the confusing outcome, the company, the trading company, has more protection within the law. The insurance company is protected more than the law, more in the law than the 130 people thrown overboard. So to go back to that question, who is the law's human? Who is the law made for? So my second question is, so how does within the law, how does this concept come to be? How does this idea, how does this confusion, how does it eventuate? How do we construct, or how has the law's human been constructed? And as I said earlier, very important to that construction is the processes, or are the processes of racialized enslavement and dispossessive colonization, but also the reasons, the driving logics for those processes, because we tend to think about the processes as separate from the logics, or we don't think about the logics at all, or at least many people don't think about the logics, and we have to remind them of those logics. So Oyeronke Oyewumi talks about the concept of the human personal body being central to the workings of Euromodern thought. She says it's the bedrock upon which the social order is founded. Think about the concept of social order itself. In any society, and all societies, the law is inherent to the social order. So if the human body, if what it means to be human is fundamental, is the foundation of the social order, then it is a question that the law has always tangled with in different ways. And one of the ways that not just the law, but the social, political, social, legal order has tried to answer this question is through these manufactured characteristics like race, gender, class, nationality, etc. And those have resulted in what we consider to be differential treatment under the law. But my sort of reflection on this, or my sense, is that that's not the most important bit. It's because these manufactured characteristics are often thought to be neutral, objective. These are just ways in which we identify different human beings. But these characteristics have hierarchies embedded within them. And so the legal constitution of the category human, it must be understood, has continued to evolve to exclude. And so these concepts of race, gender, class, nationality are used to mark those who are not included. So it's not just that, as I said, these characteristics provide or result in differential treatment under the law. So rather than looking at who is left out, we should look at how the category is itself is created, the category of human. And it has always been, or it was always essential through the periods of racialized enslavement and dispossessive colonization to narrow that category, because then you are able to identify peoples and places which can be exploited for the accumulation of capital through the dispossession of their labor, their resources, and their land. So the category, the legal constitution of the category human, is an exclusionary category, has always been an exclusionary category. So what we need to ask ourselves is, what are the outcomes of this history, this history of exclusion? So in essence, if we are in agreement with those who write on coloniality, like Anibal Quijano, Walter Mignolo, Nelson Maldonado Torres, agree that colonial logics do not cease at the end of the actual physical occupation of territory. But continue. Then the suggestion is that the colonial logics continue the work that these processes have brought into play, or as Roger Bonner Egad says, it's the co-optation of a body for purposes not its own. And so what it means to be human in the law means that being human is no longer human. What it means to be law's person is to produce a world which is inhumane at its very basics. And so we have, under UK equality law, we have this concept, we say protected characteristics, and protected characteristics include race, gender, sexuality. But then that particular concept of protected characteristics doesn't recognize, or doesn't seem to want to see that it's not that these characteristics are neutral ways of classifying humanity, but there are hierarchies embedded into those characteristics. And so I call them unprotected characteristics, because they actually point to the workings or the characteristics that produce unprotection, that produce treatment under the social, political, legal systems that we live in, that are inhuman. So that actually points to which bodies are not protected. But to think about that means that we need to consider which bodies are actually protected, or to put it differently, who has access to profligate life, who has access to life beyond what they should really be entitled to, considering our shared humanity on the face of a dying earth. So what are the outcomes? What are some of the outcomes of this constitution of laws human? What is the impact on our shared existence on earth, and what is the impact on the ontology of law itself? So one of the key and I don't want to, because I know everyone knows this, but I don't want to dwell too much on this particular point. One of the key ways in which laws human has been constructed is through this concept of race, which Stewart Hall calls a floating signifier. And this signifier is implicated in the marking of bodies and the ordering of the colonial world. And therefore, we are confronted with the violence of abstraction, which actually separates, and I sort of touched upon this earlier, separates personhood from racialized bodies. So what is actually recognized as a person is doesn't necessarily have to have a body. So I mentioned the case of the Zong. Another interesting doctrine or concept is the concept of pater sequitur ventrem, which is a Latin phrase which means that which is born follows the womb. And it was a doctrine that was adopted after, so Elizabeth Key was an enslaved woman born of a father racialized white, and her mother was an enslaved racialized Black woman. So according to common law at the time, she should have inherited her father's status as a person who was born free. That's the common law. The common law rules were that you inherit the status of your father. And when she was able to prove who her father was, she was granted her freedom, which caused quite a lot of consternation among the slaveholding states, especially in the United States of America. And they were really insistent that this should not continue, because what would then happen is a lot of enslaved people would claim their freedom because they were born of people who were racialized white and therefore free. So this doctrine was introduced, and the whole point of the doctrine was that anyone born of a woman who was racialized Black or enslaved was themselves an enslaved person. So the status followed the mother's line for people who were born of enslaved people. And essentially, this was a doctrine that sanctioned rape and sexual violence against enslaved women. and also narrowed the understanding of the body to a source of commodity generation. And this is similar to John Locke's concept of private property, or the labor theory of private property, where he argues that if you mix your labor with the land and you improve the land so the land makes a profit, you can then claim the land as private property. And this was the justification for the dispossession of a lot of the Americas. And again, he's using that concept of the human reduced to a commodity or commodity generation. And this is particularly important in the context of the Americas, where most of the labor that is used to justify, or in an explanation of this justification, is enslaved labor. So the human body, again, is reduced to its worth or value as a commodity. And if you think about a lot of the arguments we have in law nowadays are very much replicating that concept of who has value in the eyes of the law. For example, immigration law. We're interested in immigrants who are high earning. We're more interested in immigrants who are high earning. If they're not high earning, we're happy to abandon them to the waters or to whatever perdition that they are facing. So the violence of abstraction, the destruction of that category of human, has had an impact on how we experience humanity today. And so I suggest that this produces a particular vision of the world, also produces a particular vision of the law, that it's has become almost impossible for the law to properly protect both humans, but also the earth and nature that we are within which we are struggling to survive. And I want us to reflect on something. This destruction of the category human, does it travel upward and outward? Does it apply only to racialized people who are racialized non-white, or can it extend beyond that? You think about the way in which relationships between the state and human, especially labor relationships, have developed at present. I suggest that this unhumaning is becoming wide and wider. The value of what it means to be human is completely distorted. In essence, the logics of dehumanization have infected the law itself. The law finds it difficult to actually see life as we are living it. So the concept, going back to the concept of law's reasonable man, the concept of the reasonable man, and this is a question more than an answer, doesn't seem like it can actually encompass who we actually are as human. So can the law's reasonable man or reasonable person, and I say reasonable man just to recognize that we haven't actually changed the logics of it, the underpinning masculine patriarchal logics of the reasonable man. So until we change the logics, I don't think we're entitled to go to say reasonable person. So how does the law, or how can the law actually see what it means to be human, or who we are actually as humanity? Can the law see beyond this actual subject of vision, or the vision of law's ideal human, which is the white property owning heteronormative European man? Can the law see the counterpoint to that in any concrete manner? So I use the phrase, or phrase testamentary life, as a way to describe what I think being human should be or should encompass. So it's meant to be evidence of the fact that as human beings, we should be living in relation to each other. Human beings do not exist in isolation. Our realities are connected, and not just connected across space, but also connected across time. So we're connected to those who have come before us, and we are connected to those, or we should be connected to those who will come after us. And so it embodies the fact that or it also embodies the fact that our existence as humanity, there has within it many narratives, many stories, many ways in which we live, the harmony, the joy, the grief, the sadness that we're meant to contain, like the phrase, we contain multitudes, because many people have come before us, but also because we're connected to people we will never see. That concept of testamentary life is also influenced by Beatrice Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak? Because she's saying in that essay that we cannot hear the subaltern, but the subaltern is saying so many things. Do we have, going back to that question, do we have devices, especially from my own personal sort of discipline of law, do we have these devices to actually hear the subaltern? And if we don't, what do we do next? And I present as a counterpoint to testamentary life, profligate life, which is enjoyment of life beyond what one should reasonably be able to lay claim to. And on my slide there, I have someone who's eating cash as a description of or as an illustration of what I mean by the over exploitation, over excessive enjoyment of the resources of the world always at somebody else's or lots of people's expense. So in essence, to summarize everything that I have said, if Euro-modern legal thinkers have not equipped the law to handle the existential and fundamental question of who we have all been, where we have all been, who we all are, and where we all are, how then can we answer the question of who we all may become? It's the question of the future. If we destroy what it means to be human now, where do we go from here? And how do we go from here to the future? Will humanity survive? Can humanity survive? So this is kind of what I'm currently concerned with. And like I said, more questions than answers, as I always have. So this is what I'm currently concerned with. Can we? So I've got two sorts of different strands of thought. Can we become human from within the law, or do we need to stand outside of the law to really answer that question? So from within the law, we can, I suggest, possibly consider revisiting, unpacking, reinventing this legal person. As Nafin says, the legal person, which I mentioned earlier, the legal person matches the corporate form. It's merely an overarching definition for a recognized holder of rights and obligations. So what if we changed who can hold rights or obligations? I think it was in Australia that they granted legal personality to River Wanganui. So to reflect or to sort of accord with indigenous people's understandings of who and what has legal personality. That's one way to sort of expand the concept of legal personality, to almost sort of try and marry together indigenous philosophies with legal or indigenous jurisprudence with legal philosophies and legal or Euro-modern legal jurisprudence. I think there's some limitations in that, because that would mean that we are trying to collapse many things into a container that's not designed to contain those many things. So that's my concern with that approach. How do we collapse these understandings of what it means to be human into a concept that was designed for the purposes of excluding from that conception of what it means to be human? And Greer suggests that we need to rethink who the law is for by returning law to the embodied. So engage in practices that recognize the humanity or the embodiment of what it means to be human. For example, by taking post-humanist approaches or engaging in legal moves that challenge the centrality of humans, the idea of anthropocentric thinking. Again, I think that also, and not to say that these moves are not themselves useful, but I think the limitations are the same. That is, the device, the concept through which we are thinking has its boundaries. And these particular approaches don't think beyond the boundaries, but they may be moving us closer to thinking beyond the boundaries of what law is or what law can be. But I think of utmost importance is to try and figure out from within the law who is law's future human. If the law cannot take us to the future, and that's a big question, and I think it's also an important question for all legal thinkers and all thinkers. Can the law take us to the future? Can we survive as humanity on this earth with the current structure of the law? So, in the aftermath of climate change, inequality, and destruction, who will law's human be? Can we unsettle the core of law's ontological preoccupation with the legal person just from within the law? And I'm not entirely sure that we can, which brings me to my sort of alternative strand of thinking. What are the other ways of knowing or the other ways of thinking about what it means to be human within the law, especially considering Anna Greer's argument that law's human, this the DNA of the legal person, she calls it, doesn't fit anyone. So if it doesn't fit anyone, if the law is not made for being human, then how can we, what epistemologies do we have beyond the law that can answer the question, what does it mean to be human in space and time? What does it mean to be human in this world? I find a couple of concepts interesting. So there's a concept of vivre bien, which is comes from an amalgamation of indigenous concepts in mostly South and Latin America. The idea of to live well. And this has very interestingly been embedded in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights as the right to a project of life. Not to go too much into human rights law and the international human rights legal structure. There are two different covenants. You've got the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And usually it's considered that you can sort of bring a claim for a violation of a civil and or political right, like the right to life, the right to a fair trial, but it's more difficult to bring a claim for the violation of an economic, social, or cultural right, for example, the right to education. But the Inter-American Court's approach is to use the rights to a project of life to combine all of these things. So, for example, if someone's right to education is violated, that means that the quality of life is interfered with, and therefore it's neither an ESC right or civil political right. It can be both. So that's a way in which looking from beyond the law or adopting indigenous concepts of what it means to be human can be used within the law. On the African continent, we've got quite a number of philosophies. So I look at Ubuntu, Ujamaa, and Omoluabi, and these are three different concepts, but they all say similar things about how being human is about being connected to everyone else. And Euromodern law, by nature, is individualistic. So being human means you're on your own, you have rights and responsibilities. Those rights and responsibilities and obligations are yours and yours alone. But these African epistemologies from African philosophy think of being human as being connected to other people, having a responsibility for other people. So the African Court of Human Rights tried to embed this in the African Charter. Again, implementation is always the problem, which sort of brings me to a concern I have of trying to amalgamate indigenous or sort of traditional epistemologies within legal frameworks is that very often trying to embed them or trying to marry them together has resulted in a lack of implementation because we are talking about different types of frameworks or different types of structure. So is there fundamental incompatibility with bringing these other ways of knowing into Euromodern law? And if that is the case, what is the future of law? And maybe the future of law and the future of humanity are two things that we need to consider. If humanity is to survive, will the law take us into the future? And if it won't, what will? Because there still needs to be, I'm always very hesitant at making this suggestion because obviously, as a lawyer who has actually practiced law, suggesting that the law can go no further leaves me out of a job, frankly. So it's something, it's an argument I'm hesitant to make, but I think we need to consider the extreme position to, even if we want to rescue the law, we need to consider that extreme position. And I think Sylvia Winter is also quite a very good sort of avenue to think about what it means to be human. And I really absolutely love that phrase, human beings are magical. And I think what the law does is to kill the magicness of what being human is. And how do we grasp that again? And so on the second strand, thinking of what it means to be human from outside of the law, I think there are two sub-strands to my thinking there. Going back to sort of indigenous philosophies and trying to marry them to the law, or actually thinking through people like Sylvia Winter going forward. So do we go back to try and revive African philosophies? Or do we use that revival to look forward? Do we try and escape the present conditions of the human body, entrapped as they are by the law? And so, can we take lessons from futurisms? And I say futurisms to sort of point to the fact that we've got African futurism and Afrofuturism. And as someone who's more embedded in African futurism, I find it more useful to my own scholarship and analysis to engage with what is the future of Africa. So one could argue that African futurism is trying to respond to the absences of Africans in science fiction by granting a temporal lens to a spatial question. So spatial question, they're absent, but they're absent in the present from these spaces of science fiction. But the question itself is looking to the future. Will we still be Africa in the future? Because if you watch lots of science fiction that is trying to produce visions of the future, Africa doesn't exist because Africa is considered to be pre-modern. So if we get to modernity, there is no need for Africa, right? But being human for people who are African also includes being African. So being human, if the category of human is so confined and so destructive, being human under the law is suggesting in these absences that we do not exist. So how do we use these futurisms to think differently of what it means to be human, or to think about Afrofuturism, which is also a useful avenue? In Toni Morrison's book, Song of Solomon, she constructs human beings that can fly, enslaved people that can fly. Can we think of being human differently than what it is now? So to look to the future, we need to be asking ourselves, what will or can the human body become? And what or who can the law recognize or protect? And how can we make it do that? And I think for me, it's not about looking to the law and trying to make the law do something. It's about looking or trying to construct the world we want and finding the devices wherever they are to make that world, that future, that possibility happen. So I have a few concluding thoughts with which I will conclude. Uh, so the questions, or their concluding questions for reflection for everyone. So is it possible to look further than our narrow definitions of law, our restricted understanding of the world, to include indigenous jurisprudence in an effective way, in a way that actually matters, not in a performative or toxic or destructive way? Can we find other ways of knowing, being, and thinking in the world? how on earth can we use our disciplines together to save from perdition ourselves and the earth upon which we currently only very precariously survive, as we've seen with abandonment, dispossession, destruction, genocides, climate devastation. We are barely surviving. But I want to stop with these Latin phrases, which I always, not Latin, sorry, Spanish, which I always find very useful for my own thinking. Another world is possible. And we need to think about how we can create a world in which other worlds exist, how we can create a world in which all humans, whoever they are, wherever they are, whatever time they exist in, can survive this wretched earth. And I'll stop there. I think it just got to 45 minutes.
Thank you so much, Professor Adebisi. That was an enlightening presentation. And at this point, we will give room for Professor Simfree Makoni to have a 10 to 15-minute discourse with you, after which we would open the Q&A session for people to ask their questions and then also make their submissions. Professor Simfree.
Okay, thank you very much for this. I want to begin a conversation with you by taking you to some of your own work. You told, before this formal session began, I was made to understand that you also write poems. So my question is this. In your poetry, is the ontology of being human that you may construct in your poetry different from the ontologies of what it means to be human in the legal scholarship that you have just been talking about? Because one of your key interests, you say, is another world is possible. So I'm asking, is it possible that another world is possible via poetry, the sort of poetry that you write?
Thank you for that question, Professor Makoni. So I think it would be useful for me to give a backstory to why I write poetry. Yes. So I started writing poetry when I was 11. So even before
you were a lawyer. Okay.
Yeah, before I was a lawyer. And it was basically because my mother said, "You've got too much energy, do something with it." And so I did lose my first book of poetry, but I can vaguely remember that it was really bad, really bad poetry. But one of the reasons why I've continued to write poetry is it's become a way for me to express my dissatisfaction with the limitedness of legal phraseology, of legal concepts. And also as a sort of additional or supplementary examination of that problem. So when I finished my PhD, and the suggestion always is write a book from your PhD, and publish or perish, write 7-10 articles per year. And I just couldn't do it, mainly because of the register we're invited to write in, not just as academic, but specifically as legal academics. And one of the reasons I started writing a blog was because I felt in a way constipated in my writing. So I couldn't write freely. I felt I couldn't write freely because I had to be confined by this register, by this cadence of how we write in academia, in legal academia. So what I try and do, both with my poetry, but also in blog writing, is to be disobedient to that. So because I think poetry is just one of the ways in which we express what it means to be human. But I am also, like I said, I started out in practice. I am also and always a legal practitioner. So it's almost as if those two things sit uncomfortably within me. And being human also means embracing that discomfort. So I am trying to express the things that the law cannot express within my poetry, but also trying to express the things that the law does and can possibly express. And I think for me, a lot of my work is very much interested in that concept of possibility. What are the boundaries of the things that the law can do? And can we use things like poetry to actually stretch those boundaries? So then we may think, well, the law doesn't do that. And that, a lot of academia is very much involved with saying, you can't do that, or we don't do that here. But I think we can use different ways to explore the things we actually can do that we didn't know that we could. So, I mean, even in class, I read poetry to my students. I think in a couple of weeks, they're going to have some poetry as their recommended reading. And because on my teacher evaluation forms, that's one of the things they always write, that we never expected that when we came to study law, we're going to have to read poems. And that, I think, is an illustration of what, the things we don't expect are possible are actually possible. And I hope that answers your question. It's not a really, yes, it does, but I think it does that for different reasons.
Yeah, it does. And then let me continue the conversation with you. You keep repeating the phrase that you started your career in legal practice as if that was a very unfortunate and tragic set of circumstances. And then you move on. Now, I'm sort of curious, what was so bad about the legal practice? Because you keep talking about, I started in legal practice, as if I'm no lawyer, although I tried to be a lawyer for one semester, I didn't succeed. But that's a story for another day. The issue is this then. What is so fundamentally different in how the ontology of human beings is framed in legal practice with how you experience the similar ideas as a legal scholar?
Thank you for that question. So that's a big question for reflection for me, because I wouldn't say that's the way I think of it, but I suspect that at the back of my mind, it is. I do think of it in that way, and so it comes across that I'm saying that. To be honest, I didn't want to practice law.
Yeah.
But once you qualify as a lawyer, it's kind of expected that you have to try it out. So I got myself a wig and gown, and I practice. I should point out that I practice law in Nigeria, where wearing a wig and gown is not. It's not comfortable because it's about 40 degrees and you're sweating, and you're seated because the courtrooms don't have any air conditioner or fans or electricity, so you're sitting in sort of very stuffy rooms. And one of the reasons why we call new lawyers new wigs is because the old lawyers don't wash their wigs or their gowns. So some of them haven't washed their gowns for like 40 years, and they're seated next to you in 40-degree weather. So that is probably what I remember most from my legal practice. But to answer, but I actually found it more interesting than I thought I would. Than I thought I would find it, because it was finding out how the law actually worked in practice was really interesting. But what I found a little bit sort of limiting about legal practice, and it's limiting in the sense that I always wanted to become a scholar, was that the legal profession is not exceptionally creative. And it has to be that way because things have to be predictable. Because if they're not predictable, how do you ensure that justice is done? So there's there's a tension there, right, between how creative you can be in legal practice, and also the disconnect between legal practice and scholarship is unfortunate, because if there was a closer connect, then the legal practice could could be in partnership with scholarship and be more creative in that sense, and then scholarship could also sort of be more aware of praxis. So I think the way in which the law in practice conceives of what it means to be human follows the line of what is settled, while there are more possibilities within scholarship to examine these questions. The limitations of scholarship is that very often we are sitting in our offices talking about these possibilities, and those ideas never go beyond those offices or conferences which only academics go to, or we write them in articles that nobody will ever read because we've used very and I said ontology a few too many times today. I tried not to say it, but we use words that no other human being is really interested in listening to, and so there's also a limit, sort of a limitation with academia in that sense. So we can examine possibility, but we don't really put it into practice as we could or should.
Okay. Now my last question before I hand over to my colleagues is this: if one of the key essences of legal training or legal practices is predictability, the need to be predictable, not so much to be right, because I don't think lawyers ever understand what it means to be right. I think they're more interested in being predictable than being right. If you then decolonize your legal curriculum, don't you throw into chaos that central pillar which the legal educational system holds dear, that is the need to be predictable? Right. Because one of the outcomes of any decolonized curriculum is to some extent some level of unpredictability, because you are shifting the responsibility to the individuals concerned. So how do you reconcile those two? How do you reconcile the tension between trying to decolonize something, but at the same time retaining a level of predictability, which is one of the core pillars in the curriculum in law?
So that's a big question, and I've tried to avoid it avoid the question in so many ways and so many times. I remember one of my blog posts, I think I wrote it in December of 2019, is titled "Decolonization is Impossible." And my argument for that is, if we're thinking of decolonization means decolonizing everything. I don't think you can actually say you've decolonized, and this is I have to say this is my personal position. I don't think you can decolonize your curriculum if it sits. So if I'm teaching, say for example, I teach a unit, let's say law of contract, and it sits within an entire degree where no one else is interested in decolonization, or we all decolonize everything, or we say we've decolonized what we're teaching, but we're still in a university that where the students have to pay fees.
Yes.
So my worry is that we're too quick to say that we've decolonized anything. And so my suggestion would be to answer your question, that I don't think I'm decolonizing my curriculum. I put it differently. So I say, can we dream of new anti-colonial worlds from within the law school?
Okay.
Which would mean that we would have to dream of different ways for the law to work. Maybe predictability, or maybe to avoid predictability, but there are bigger, wider questions beyond predictability, which one of them may be what it means to be human. If what it means to be human changes, maybe the problem of predictability is no longer a problem, because predictability relies on, one of the things that predictability relies on is fixed ideas and narrow ideas of what it means to be human, narrow ideas of what it means to have value in the eyes of the law. So I would say I try and avoid saying a thing is decolonized as long as the world still operates on colonial logics, in which sense we should be within academia more focused on producing concepts that are anti-colonial and trying to put them into practice, which is a long process.
Okay.
Yep.
Right. Okay, that's fine. Fair. Let me hand over to Nana Anna, and she will get some other people to jump in, because there are a lot of questions in the chat.
Thank you so much, Professor Marconi. There are a couple of questions in the chat box, and the first is from Professor Scott Bennett. And he says, in recent days in the Gaza Strip, which I see as the doorway of Africa's Sinai Gate to Asia via the so-called Holy Land, the indigenous Palestinian population has been demonized by Israeli government spokesmen as animal, that is, non-human. Scott says he's grateful to you for your wonderful presentation today, for implicitly posing the question, what might it mean for these people to qualify legally as human in the Israeli colonial settler world of Palestinian dispossession and enslavement? He's also simply registering his astonishment at the timelines of your presence with us this morning. He doesn't hope for an answer, but he certainly wants to register the question. And he also adds that he's absolutely in love with the evocative and graphic illustration you provided on your screen.
I just wanted to quickly register that that's Michael Scott, not Scott. But it's Michael's question, not Scott's question.
Thanks for the correction. I am so sorry. I am so sorry. I'm so familiar with Scott Bennett that I assumed he was the one as soon as I saw the Scott. I'm sorry.
No problem, Nana. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I mean, I don't think there's a question as such that you are asking, and so I'm really grateful for your thoughts. And it has really been interesting trying to write this lecture at the time when all this is happening, and you can see. I was just thinking today of the announcement in, I think it was 1899, where the German occupiers of what is now Namibia says, well, you must leave or die, and there's nowhere to go to, and how that's often been called the first genocide of the 20th century, and then how these things repeat themselves, and we don't seem to have the bandwidth to recognize those repetitions as the same logic's being repeated. And I don't know how we have that bandwidth, because to me it seems so straightforward, but then again, I've been reading these books for ages and ages. So I do hope we find ways to revisit that question of what it means to be human. And thank you again.
Okay, the next question is from Busi Makoni, and she asks, how did you resolve your writing constipation? She says she's experiencing it now and she would love some home remedies to solve it. 3 other people seem to be in agreement with her, so.
Oh, Lord. So, I mean, I think I've also been lucky. So I was talking about writing a blog, and I know Phoebe mentioned my blog and it was all very, very coincidental, because I had complete writer's block, because as I said, you finish your PhD, and for me, I actually don't really want to share too much of my confusing career trajectory, but I wasn't really sure at the time if I wanted to stay in academia, and I'm not entirely sure if I was talking to my younger self, I wouldn't say, run for the hills, academia is the bad place. However, because I then decided to stay in academia, the messaging you get is, write, and I couldn't find my voice. So someone told me, well, don't write academic articles, just write a blog. And if you, I'm sure you don't have the time to do this, but if you look through like the old versions or the first things I wrote, it was just basically me trying to struggle for words and trying to write in the way in which I speak, because academia is not really like that. And because I'm multilingual and keep on trying to learn languages, I'm currently learning Spanish and French, and struggling through trying to learn Turkish as well. So because I've got so many languages in my head, everything I write is infused by those sort of multiplicity of languages. And so writing the blog became for me an escape route. But what then happened, and this is why I said I've really been lucky, was that people will come up to me. So even students will come up to me and say, well, we read that thing that you wrote on, and I used, I still do this. I wrote a blog trying to use Bridgerton to explain Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak? So yeah, but you can't do that in academia. But it's a way for me to explore my thoughts on, what Spivak is saying, is to apply it to something that I find more interesting than reading Spivak. And people will read this. My colleagues would read that, and then I would get invitations to come and talk on panels about, I read the thing you wrote, come and talk to us about it. And that became an avenue for me to sort of go back to writing, because I was then writing and expressing myself about things I was actually interested in. My PhD thesis is something I'm definitely not interested in. I didn't feel like breaking it down into a book or writing articles about it. So I would say I resolved my writing constipation by writing, which is not by taking any herbal medicines or home brews, but just by writing, but being able to speak in my own voice and finding an avenue in which I could speak in my own voice. And doesn't necessarily have to be a blog. You can journal. You can sort of have a writing group, which has also worked really well for me. Finding a group of people who are roughly saying the same thing and having writing meetings has also been very useful.
Thank you so much. We have another one from Cecil. She says, thanks for your inspiring talk. And she asks that, could you elaborate on what it would look like in practice? She's asking this in connection with what you spoke about on thinking outside law. Could you explain how it would be like in practice?
Thank you, Cecil, for that question. I think using Bridgerton to explain Spivak is one example, but I think, over sort of describing it in an overarching way is to think of sources beyond the law or disciplines beyond the law, but also understanding that the law's boundaries cannot be fixed. And that's the way in which I see that the law's boundaries are not fixed, and therefore what we can bring in to understand what the law is doing cannot be limited. So a lot of my teaching I bring in, so teaching I just did this week, there was no legal scholar in all the reading I gave my students. They did Charles Mills, political philosopher. They read things from sociology. So they're doing a lot of non-legal reading, and they always find that interesting and also worrying, because we've told them that this is how lawyers write and this is how lawyers think. And then I'm saying to them, ignore all of that. And I've asked them to read, because some of them have gone out to buy the book now. I've asked them to read Octavia Butler's Kindred, which I used to teach them about the passage of time. And I've actually written an article on that and how Octavia Butler's Kindred tells us what it can tell us about teaching jurisprudence and legal history. So what I'm just saying, with these few examples, is an understanding that there should be no boundaries in our understanding of our disciplines, and we can bend those boundaries for the purpose of thinking better and creatively about the world.
Thank you so much. I laughed when I saw this question. And the question was, why do lawyers wear wigs and gowns?
Somebody answered that question. I think it was Scott first name answered the question. There's no other reason than because the lawyers that originally existed and taught Nigerian lawyers wore wigs. So it's if you think about it, it's a whole history of people wearing wigs because their hair was falling out. Now we wear wigs. And we wear wigs because that's how it's always been done, which goes back to the whole concept of legal practice and legal analysis itself, how stuck we are in these loops. And this is the way we've always written, this is the way we've always, talked, and therefore we must talk that way.
Point will call on Oyerunke Oyewumi to share her submissions.
Foluke, if I may, it's nice to meet you, at least virtually. And thank you for that wonderful presentation. So many questions, so much to think about. I can't wait to read your book. But let me start with my first question. Are you familiar with Olufemi Taiwo's book on Against Decolonization? Okay, good. Did you think anything of it in regard to your own lack of comfort with this decolonizing everything that we're trying to do? That's my first question.
Okay. So it's taking me a second to speak because there's no other way to say this. I'm a massive fan of your work. As you see, you were cited in my, and in the book, you occupy almost the whole chapter. So I'm a massive fan of your work, so I'm almost speechless at the moment. But yes, because I was just about to say, when you said Olufemi Taiwo, which one of them? Because
I know, the senior.
The senior, yeah. So we actually have a reading group where we're reading that book at the moment. I think, so his arguments, I think, have some merit and also concern me at the same time, because I do see the point with, one, everyone's decolonizing everything. But the problem which I've always had is a lot of people are critiquing the misuse of decolonization rather than decolonization. Or to think of it differently, what on earth is decolonization? Do we know? So, and this is what I try and grapple with in my own book, trying to answer that question. Because on the one hand, it's either this is actually decolonization and it's a horrible thing because everyone's just, too tied to the idea that colonization produces sort of a limited way of thinking, but also the idea that colonization or decolonization suggests that there's a loss of agency for African people. And so this I would say would be my own problem with, or my concern with the book, is that it replicates some of the arguments against decolonization that I have seen that are actually arguments against the misuse of decolonization. But it does also reflect my concern with people's quick suggestion to say they can decolonize anything. And I'm not entirely sure that we can. And I think it's okay to exist in that tension that maybe it's possible that this is the world we have and it's bound for destruction, which is not a happy idea for a Friday morning, but maybe that is it. But if that is the case, can we live any better? To live any better, we must reckon with the fact that certain modalities of life have been produced through the colonial enterprise, and those modalities of life should be confronted, and maybe we can dream. And that's why I use the phrase, can we dream of new anti-colonial worlds from within the law school or from within our universities? Maybe we can dream of disrupting them. But if we do not change the world at all, we continue in the way in which we are headed, we are bound for destruction. That is assured destruction of the earth and everything on it. So where do these logics come from? They are bound in the colonial enterprise. We cannot dispute that fact. And I think that would be my concern with his work, that it doesn't entirely reckon with that connectedness to the colonial enterprise.
Okay, I like that. And I like your phrase, can we dream of anti-colonial worlds, right? And I think there's an intersection there with Femi Taiwo's work, because there are some parts of his work that I appreciate too, but there's a whole lot, especially when he says something like, well, colonization ended in 1960 in Nigeria. I don't agree with that. But some of the intersections I see, and even in your presentation, is that the world we live in, this colonially produced world, was also produced by the resistance of enslaved people, the resistance of people who fought for independence, people who fought for human rights. And we even in law, I know for a fact that in the US, for example, people always talk about the civil rights movement and the rights that African Americans fought for, and how other groups are able to benefit from those rights today. So as we talk about decolonizing, and as we talk about our dissatisfaction with the world as it is, I think at one level, we must not forget that not everything that was produced during slavery, or not everything that was produced during colonization, came from the colonizers. And there were other possible worlds even within that. And I'm wondering how that kind of consciousness can enable us to go forward and live better. Then one final thing. I heard about 2 weeks ago, I listened to a lecture, and I'm just so fascinated. I don't even know that I totally understand it. But one of the takeaways, and this lecture was by Louis Chudi Sokai, who is a literary critic but does Afrofuturism and all that. And part of what he talked about was AI. And the way in which he talked about AI is that, isn't there a possibility that artificial intelligence would become human or be regarded as human if we're not already doing it? And the way in which he also provoked us to think about AI claiming humanity is that, after all, Black people were supposed to be non-human. And they claimed humanity and forced the colonizers, the enslavers, to at least take them seriously up to a point. And that we cannot rule out the possibility of AI, even though we keep treating it as if it's non-human. Suppose it acquires the power and forces us to recognize its own entity, humanity, or what have you. So what do you think of all that?
Well, so yeah, those are very interesting questions. So I think the first question was, how do we reconcile the good things that came out of the sort of like civil rights movement, the anti-colonial movements, with the current moves for decolonization? And I think that goes back to my point about the way in which people are conceiving of decolonization as something that we can do in sort of short, in small silos. And I think that it's problematic to think of it in that way. We need to think of it as we are connected to those struggles. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the things that's useful that's a useful way to think about where we are at present, because we should not want to divorce decolonization now from decolonization yesterday. And this quote from Audre Lorde, which has been misquoted a lot, can the master's tools dismantle the master's house? I often sort of say in response, so who built the master's house? Where are the tools from? and to understand kind of like what you are saying, that the world we exist in is produced by this push and pull. So there is the end of enslavement is brought about by that, by the process of people who resisted slavery, who reasserted their humanity. But we also need to understand that the law responds to that. And if you look at the legislation and the case law that sort of produces the end of enslavement, the end of colonization, a lot of that tries to manage the disruption of that process. So rather than granting boundless freedom, the law actually manages the process, for example, with compensation of slave owners in the UK to ensure that they don't lose anything. So you grant some people freedom, but you also ensure that those who were holding the slaves do not lose anything economically. And a lot of the law, civil rights, push and pull is like that. So the things we gain, we should be able to identify what they are so we don't lose them in our joy at, well, this is the end of this now. And I think South Africa, end of apartheid, and the current sort of decolonization, fees must fall, roads must fall movement also illustrates that legislation doesn't bring a thing completely to an end. And so we are always involved in the process of becoming human once again, which then leads me to the AI question. Abeba Behan, who writes on AI, because she's an AI person, is my go-to on this subject. And one of the things that I think I take from her concept of is AI sentient or is AI human goes back to what I was saying about this narrow understanding of what it means to be human. If AI has replicated that narrow understanding, it is not human because we are not human or we are not seen as human. Can AI be as human as we are? In reality, not in the eyes of the law, in reality? Can it grieve? Can it cry? Can it, be angry? Can it rage in the ways that we feel things deeply? And that's a question I cannot answer, but I think that's what we should really be thinking about rather than the discrimination against AI, not considering it being human yet. And I think what human means is what we should be thinking of rather than or we should be thinking of unburdening or unpacking that narrow understanding of what it means to be human rather than trying to, as with the River Wanganui, trying to make everything or give everything legal personality. We should actually try and engage with what does it mean to have legal personality.
Thank you.
Nana, you are muted.
I was having a bit of a technical challenge. Yes, I'm back. So we had Desmond Odogo who commented when you remarked about wearing wigs and gowns in Nigeria in the 40 degrees heat, and he remarked that he was currently in the 40 degrees heat. We have Scott Bennett. Scott, you are on.
Okay, thank you so much, Nana Anna. And thank you, Dr. Adebisi, for a fantastic presentation today. I study environmentalist discourses, one of the things, so I'm very interested in this question of personhood for the Whanganui River. And some of your comments today have kind of unlocked my thinking, so I just wanted to run something past you and see if this makes any sense. So historically, this white male heteronormative rational person that was constructed as kind of the subject of enlightenment, the subject of development, the subject of progress, became almost like a disembodied thing, an idealization, an abstraction that is a violent abstraction, and to a certain extent is wound up in our modern companies law, sort of like the idea of what a corporation is, and to a certain extent is a way to kind of abstract not only humanity from actual human bodies, but also responsibility from human bodies. So we have corporations constructed as rationally maximizing profit, and being obligated to maximize the way that the earth is used as a resource and to deliver value to shareholders. So it's kind of like, it's hard to get all of, you know, the white men who profit from these corporations into prison when the corporation makes, you know, does something illegal or pollutes or whatever it might be. At the same time, we have kind of the Lockean tradition of property, where property is constructed as something that comes into being through a logic of maximizing productivity. So Locke's whole thing with the arguments on which he grounds property law is, or property, the philosophy of property, is that indigenous people aren't making good use of the land because they just basically, you know, they're chilling on the land. They're just living, you know, the life of kind of Arcadia on the land. So it's actually our responsibility to go and take it from them and to own it, because then we can mix our labor with it and maximize it and make it more productive. So on both accounts, we've got this idea of the person that is a violent abstraction, and an idea of land that sees it only as a commodity that is supposed to be maximizing profitability. Fast forward to New Zealand, Aotearoa, and giving personhood to the river. It's almost like trying to short circuit that idea by just saying, look at this piece of land, let's turn it into a person. So the short circuiting is not going to work because it doesn't actually address the fundamentals. It doesn't go down into how do we understand, you know, land in Euro-modern law, or however we describe it, or how do we understand people in Euro-modern law. It kind of reproduces those violences. It does short circuit them, but it doesn't actually solve any of the fundamental problems about our relation to the world. Would that be something that makes sense?
Yeah, I would say exactly. And you gave a very succinct description of Locke's labor theory of property, and also my own problems with it. And I think that also describes my problems with granting the river legal personality. And I think the way in which you described it makes a lot of sense. It's short-circuiting that. It's trying to solve the problem by putting something that doesn't fit together. So there's something that I wrote. It should be published quite soon. And I'll send it to you when they send me the thing they send for copy editing. So I was trying to answer these sorts of problems. How do you protect the earth? How do you protect human beings in environmental law, especially if the law is not designed for that protection? And so they asked us to sort of try and think of this through rewriting judgment. So, you know, there's this whole rewriting judgments project. So it's called the Anthropocene Judgments Project. So my judgment was, what if the sea judged the earth, but not taking any of the legal sort of devices that we already have around what it means to be a person? So what type of law actually protects the earth is the question I was trying to answer, which sort of responds to what you were saying. Rather than trying to sort of almost distort the law to accept the personality of the river, what if we abandoned the concept of personality altogether? What if the, you know, so the idea of the ocean judging humanity in some way also relies on the personality of the ocean. And I do mention that in my commentary, that I am limited. So going back to what Professor Makoni was saying, I am limited by my experience in legal practice, that I have to use the tools that I have, however traumatic or not traumatic that experience was. But I think it was trying to push those boundaries, and that exercise did give me, I remember, because I presented it to my colleagues, and they all complained about brain pain from what I was trying to come up with, because telling lawyers to abandon the concept of law is quite a drastic endeavor, and I'm just happy that I survived the without being stoned, survived the experience. But they were really very sort of helpful, and it was a generative conversation. And I think these are the sorts of conversations, these presumptions have to be questioned. And I think that's what you're doing as well. So it makes a lot of sense to me.
So much. We have a question from Lauren, and she thanks you for your wonderful talk. And she's wondering whether you know of the recent book of Zakia Iman Jackson's, which she says that she listened to Zakia Iman Jackson's Becoming Human, Matter and Meaning in an Anti-Black World, and she got to know of that in the grad seminar class. And she's wondering whether you've had a chance to check out his recent book and how its pan-humanities approach to the question of humanism and defining humans.
Thank you, Lauren, for that question. I must confess, I've read the book. I read the book as part of my research for writing my book, but it's now a cloud of confused words, all the books I read at the time. So I can't remember, I can remember the cover of it, if that helps at all. But I remember that I found, because one of the things I was reading the book for was that conception of anti-Blackness, and I found the conception of anti-Blackness and what lies beyond that very useful. I just can't remember exactly what it was.
There we go again with the technical challenge. Busi Makoni has a comment on the Odd Lord quote. I think that there are different ways of reading it. She thinks that if we focus on who built the house and who made the tools, that is different from looking at it from the viewpoint of ownership. Building the house and making tools for ownership by the master is different from building the house and making tools for ownership by the non-human. To her, the architectural makeup of the house built for the master and the tools made for the master means the non-human is capable of building a different house and making different tools for the non-human self. To her, using the tools owned by the master to destroy the house owned by the master may not work because the master may have made alterations to the architectural makeup of the tools. However, if we make tools whose architectural makeup is known by the master, then we can quickly destroy the house. What do you say about this, Professor Foluke?
I love that. That's really, really engaging with that metaphor very deeply. I think so. When I say that we need to question who owns the tools, who owns the house, I'm only asking people, I'm inviting people to sort of think differently about the quotes, because it's very much like these academic slogans that we use. For example, decolonization is not a metaphor, where we don't read the actual context of the quote, and the quote itself becomes the thing. And especially with something like decolonization is not a metaphor, it's very on the nose, because decolonization is not a metaphor itself becomes a metaphor for action. And the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house, sometimes becomes a metaphor for inaction, for not doing anything. But also to sort of navigate the concept of ownership is also a very legal and Euromodern concept. When we say this is the master's house, how are we understanding what it means to be the master's house and what we want to do with it? And it's, and not to sort of discount your point, Busi, I think it's a point well made, and that's why the quote itself is still powerful. It's just that sometimes we need to not think outside the box, but maybe abandon the box completely. Because when we think outside the box also constructs what we're doing outside of it. But sometimes we need to step back from the box and completely rethink what it is we're doing and how we want to engage with our sort of shared thoughts.
Thank you so much for that. We'll call on Dorothy.
Professor Adebisi, thank you so much for your fascinating presentations. And considering that I'm citing you, colleagues of our, mine and I are citing you in something we're doing about decolonizing hegemonic narratives. So you might know Natasha Carver at Bristol. So maybe you might know her. We are working on a project now about decolonizing hegemonic narratives about FGCM and all of that. And I mean, it's fascinating for me when I read more current feminists who are sort of like criticizing that certain types of feminists were complicit with the law to dehumanize, because everything was enshrined in what we call human rights advocacy, forgetting that once we plug into the space of international law, there are gray areas that continues to sort of dehumanize the woman, dehumanize African culture, dehumanize ways that perhaps we build our master's house down here and everything. So I'm asking for your thoughts generally on that, in that space of feminist activism, right, and human rights advocacy, and how perhaps you can give me more information about how it becomes more complicit and how perhaps we can dissociate this advocacy so that we don't really become tools that are being used by the international activism space to continue this hegemony and this colonization that is happening. Yeah.
Thank you for your question, Dorothy. I think you were in Bristol earlier this year.
Yes, I was.
Yeah, there was a round table, I remember, which I unfortunately could not attend. So I'm sorry to have missed your visit to Bristol, and I hope you had a wonderful time. It's a lovely city. Yeah, so I mean that's a big question. I remember I gave a whole hour talk on that, and a couple of probably around this time last year. And I don't think there's an easy answer. I think some of the problems have to do with the human rights structure itself that a lot of this advocacy relies upon. And one of the ways in which I came into legal scholarship was through international human rights law, and eventually finding it inadequate to my needs. And I remember a student of mine many years ago now wrote a dissertation on the problem with human rights is not the rights, it's the human, which I found really fascinating. But it's Anna Greer, who I've mentioned earlier, who talks about how the fulfillment of human rights is reliant on almost a pre-existing right to capital. For example, the fulfillment of the right to health is reliant on companies being able to make money. The fulfillment of the right to a clean environment is reliant on companies being satisfied that they've exploited the earth enough. And again, I think it's about stepping back and going, what do we want? Irrespective of what the law says, or things like the social development goals, sustainable development goals, irrespective of what those goals are telling us we should be wanting, what do we actually, what world are we dreaming of, and what do we need to bring that dream into fruition? Is there anything that exists that we can use? If there isn't, do we have to create new things? And that helps us to draw the line between things we should not be touching because they are toxic, even though they look good, and things that we can actually use without just being almost defeatist about some of the tools that we can actually use. And also thinking of those tools as something that we are, in some cases, using as a gap between when we can build new tools, right? Because we often think of these things as ends in themselves. So, for example, the end of colonization should not be the end of the story. And this is kind of what people like Kwame Nkrumah were pointing to, or Amilcar Cabral, Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, the fact that there needs to be life beyond that, what I call testamentary life. End of colonization doesn't bring it, but it's an avenue. that can be used. So the anti-colonial movements are an avenue that can be used to get to life beyond that. In the same way, feminist theory, especially when you start beginning to think about Black feminist theory and intersectionality, can be avenues which we then understand as these are not routes to salvation, but they're tools we can use to engage with building better worlds. But I think Gayatri Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak, which I tend to almost feel as if I'm punishing my students when I ask them to read it. It's a very dense piece of writing. But her central argument is that we're speaking on behalf of people, especially women in what is designated the Global South, who are at the other end of capital. Can the Subaltern Speak is not a question that is asking whether the subaltern can speak. It's a question that is saying, can we hear the subaltern through the processes that we currently have? And if we are, for example, because I used to write on FGM, if we are talking about FGM, a lot of the processes through which we are talking about this is silencing the voices of those whom on whose behalf we claim to be speaking for. And again, it's that thing of how do we get to the point where their voices are heard or they can speak? And I think these are gradual processes rather than things we can attain at a sort of first try. And to me, that's the problem with advocacy or sort of like international human rights structures, is that we often think that being in those spaces is absolution itself. Once I sort of label myself as a humanitarian, that is it. I've done everything. I don't need to change, what I'm doing. It's, I've got the label of humanitarian, and that's the solution. But we always need to think about who are we speaking for? And would it be better for us to sometimes just be quiet and find ways for them to speak, especially in an academic sense, because we are often producing knowledge for the purposes of our own career progression. And that sort of knowledge is not, in most cases, not helpful to anyone. Apart from ourselves, obviously, because we get paid more when we get promoted. So we need to sort of sit with that discomfort that a lot of self-interest is involved in the structures through which we produce knowledge about those who we can label or call subalterns.
Right. Narana, if I may, thank you very much, Foluke, for that. If I may continue, so it's discomforting right now in the Gambia where I think human rights activists are on the street, right, saying that those that are trying to repeal the FGM law are anti-legal, anti-African. In this same space, one of our collaborators, Wambai Ahmadu, has a place where it's trying to sort of like advocate for the fact that women can choose. They can choose to, because we have all this argument about body politics, right, in the African feminist space and everything. And when you have these respected feminists taken to the street saying that a repeal of the law, which is basically from the colonial law against FGM, right, and the way trying to fix Africa that came after the development era, of the World War II. And these people on the street advocating that a repeal of that law is actually against, it's going to sort of making the woman's case worse. And in that same space, we have people that are saying, wait a minute, can you stop speaking? Let us hear what the women really want, and then we can have a conversation. And so this conundrum where these people you aspire to be, people you cite their work, are on the street, trying to silence the same people that they are speaking for. I think this is hard for me, especially when I'm doing feminist work. And yeah, I just needed to rant. Forgive me. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah.
Right.
I think that rant was understandable.
Thank you so much. As the conversation becomes deeper and deeper, you lose track of time. And that is exactly what has happened to us. So we'll call on Professor Makoni to end this formal session, and then we'll have an after party.
Okay. Thank you very much to everybody for finding the time to engage in these very interesting ideas. Is Vishna around so that she can let us know who is coming next?
I'll do that.